I woke up on a Tuesday morning in March to find a construction crew tearing up the back corner of my property in Asheville, North Carolina, and nobody had bothered to ask my permission or even give me a heads up. I stood there in my bathrobe and slippers, coffee mug in hand, watching a small excavator dig up the land my grandfather had left me, the land where I'd spent countless summer afternoons as a kid climbing trees and building forts. The crew had already cleared about 30 feet of vegetation and were laying down gravel for what appeared to be some kind of pathway. "Hey!" I shouted over the noise of the machinery. "What the hell's going on here?" A middle-aged guy in a hard hat looked up from his clipboard and walked over. "Morning, sir. Just following the work order. HOA approved walking path connecting the two subdivisions." "The HOA approved what?" I set my coffee mug down on a nearby stump. "This is my property. Private property. Nobody asked me about any walking path." The contractor pulled out a rolled-up blueprint from under his arm. "According to this survey, this section falls within the community easement zone. The homeowners association has the right to develop pathways and common areas within designated zones." I grabbed the blueprint and studied it. Sure enough, someone had marked a line cutting diagonally across the back portion of my 3-acre lot. The problem was, I'd reviewed every single document when I inherited this place from my grandfather 2 years ago, and there was absolutely no easement on my property. Zero. My lawyer had been thorough about that because I specifically wanted to make sure the HOA couldn't pull anything. "Stop," I said firmly. "Stop all work right now. This is a mistake." The contractor sighed like he'd dealt with this a million times before. "Look, sir, I'm just doing my job. You'll need to take it up with the HOA board. We've got a signed work order and we're on schedule. If we stop now, there'll be delays and additional costs." "I don't care about your schedule. This is my land and you're trespassing. Stop the work or I'm calling the police." He studied my face for a moment, probably trying to figure out if I was serious. I was. He finally pulled out his phone and made a call, presumably to whoever hired his crew. After a brief conversation, he motioned to his workers and they shut down the equipment. "We're pausing for now," he said. "But the HOA will be in touch. They're not going to be happy about this delay." Yeah, well, I'm not too happy about people destroying my property without permission, so I guess we're even. I went back inside and immediately called my lawyer, Richard Summers, who I'd kept on retainer specifically for HOA issues. I'd known from day one that the Mountain View Estates Homeowners Association was going to be a problem. They'd sent me 17 violation notices in the first year alone, everything from my grass being half an inch too tall to my mailbox being the wrong shade of black. Every single notice had been dismissed because every single one was either fabricated or based on rules that weren't actually in the HOA bylaws. Richard answered on the third ring. "Gregory, what's going on?" "They're building on my property, Richard. Actual construction. A walking path they claim is in an easement zone that doesn't exist." "Slow down. Who's building what?" I explained the situation while watching through my back window as the construction crew packed up their equipment. Richard listened without interrupting, which I appreciated because I was pretty worked up. "Okay," he said when I finished. "First thing, don't let them do any more work. You already stopped them, which is good. Second, I'm going to pull up your deed and property survey. Third, I'm going to send a cease and desist letter to the HOA board today. Do not engage with them directly until we figure out what's happening here." Too late for that. I'm sure they're already on their way. I was right. 30 minutes later, my doorbell rang. I opened it to find Kimberly Patterson, the HOA board president, standing on my front porch with her arms crossed. Kimberly was exactly what you'd picture when someone says, HOA president, perfectly styled blonde hair, designer athleisure outfit that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage, and an expression that suggested she smelled something unpleasant. "Mr. Quinn," she said, managing to make my name sound like an insult, "we have a serious problem." "Yes, we do. Your construction crew was tearing up my property without permission." Our construction crew was beginning work on a community improvement project that was approved by the board 3 months ago. The walking path is outlined in the community development plan, which all residents agreed to when they purchased property in Mountain View Estates. I didn't purchase property in Mountain View Estates. I inherited it, and there is no easement on my land. Kimberly pulled out a folder from her designer handbag. This is the updated community map showing all designated common areas and easement zones. Your property clearly falls within the pathway corridor. I took the document and looked at it. Someone had indeed drawn my property into their little corridor. This is a map you created. It doesn't supersede my actual deed, which shows no easements whatsoever. You can't just decide my private property is now community space. The HOA board has the authority to develop community amenities for the benefit of all residents. This walking path will connect the east and west sections of the neighborhood, providing safe pedestrian access and increasing property values for everyone. Not with my land, it won't. Her expression hardened. Mr. Quinn, I understand you're upset about the lack of notification, and I apologize for that oversight. However, the work has been approved and contracted. If you continue to obstruct this project, you'll be in violation of the HOA agreement and subject to daily fines. I actually laughed at that. You're going to fine me for not letting you build on my property? That's rich. Get off my porch. Kimberly. Any further communication goes through my lawyer. This isn't over, she said, turning on her heel. The board will be discussing this at tonight's emergency meeting. Great. My lawyer will be there. She walked back to her white Mercedes SUV with the personalized license plate that read MVEHOA1 and drove off. I called Richard back immediately. She just showed up at my house with a fake easement document. They're having an emergency board meeting tonight. I'll be there, Richard said. In the meantime, I've pulled your deed. Gregory, there is absolutely no easement on your property. None. Whatever they're claiming, it's not legally valid. They cannot build on your land without your permission. So what's their angle here? Either someone made a genuine mistake and drew the pathway wrong, or they're hoping you'll just roll over and let them do it. HOAs try this kind of thing more often than you'd think. They assume homeowners don't know their rights or won't spend the money to fight back. They assumed wrong. The emergency HOA board meeting was held that evening at the community center, a building I'd successfully avoided for the entire 2 years I'd lived in Mountain View Estates. Richard and I arrived 15 minutes early and took seats in the back row. The room gradually filled with neighbors I barely knew, most of them looking confused about why they'd been summoned on short notice. Kimberly called the meeting to order at exactly 7 o'clock. She was flanked by 4 other board members, including Vice President Sharon Whitmore and Treasurer Daniel Chen. The rest I didn't recognize. Thank you all for coming on such short notice, Kimberly began. We're here to discuss an urgent situation regarding the Mountain View Connector Path project. As many of you know, the board approved this community enhancement 3 months ago with overwhelming support. The pathway will provide safe pedestrian access between our 2 main residential sections, eliminating the need to walk along Hemlock Road, which lacks sidewalks and has limited visibility. A few people nodded. I had to admit the idea itself wasn't terrible. Hemlock Road was dangerous for pedestrians, but that didn't give them the right to use my property. Unfortunately, Kimberly continued, one resident has decided to obstruct the project by refusing access to the designated pathway corridor. This obstruction has resulted in construction delays and additional costs that will ultimately burden the entire community. People started looking around, trying to figure out who the problem resident was. Richard put a hand on my arm, silently telling me to wait. The resident in question is Gregory Quinn, who inherited property at 847 Mountain View Drive. Mr. Quinn has refused to honor the community easement agreement and has threatened our contracted construction crew. That got me on my feet. That's not what happened. Mr. Quinn, Kimberly said in a condescending tone, you'll have an opportunity to speak during the public comment period. No, I'll speak now since you're misrepresenting the facts. I didn't threaten anyone. I told them to stop trespassing on my private property, and there is no easement agreement because no easement exists on my deed. Richard stood up beside me. Richard Summers, attorney representing Mr. Quinn. For the record, I've reviewed Mr. Quinn's deed and property survey. There is no easement. The board cannot unilaterally claim private property for community use. If construction resumes on Mr. Quinn's land without his express written permission, it constitutes trespassing and potentially criminal property damage. The room erupted in conversation. Kimberly banged her gavel, which I didn't even know HOA meetings had. Mr. Summers, the board has documentation showing the easement zone was established as part of the original community planning when Mountain View Estates was developed. Then I'd like to see that documentation, please, along with the recorded easement that would appear on the county property records, because I've checked, and it doesn't exist. Kimberly's face flushed. The county records may not be updated yet. The easement was part of the internal community agreement. Internal agreements don't supersede legal property rights, Richard said calmly. If the easement isn't recorded with the county, it's not valid. Even if it were recorded, it would need to be signed by the property owner, which in this case was Mr. Quinn's grandfather, and later Mr. Quinn himself. Neither signed any such agreement. Daniel Chen, the treasurer, leaned over and whispered something to Kimberly. She nodded and turned back to the room. We'll table this discussion pending a review of the documentation. However, Mr. Quinn should be aware that obstructing community improvement projects may result in penalties. Are you threatening my client? Richard asked. I'm informing him of potential consequences. Good. Then I'm informing you that any penalties, fines, or further construction attempts will result in legal action against the HOA board, both collectively and individually. We'll seek damages for trespassing, property damage, harassment, and any other applicable claims. Is that clear? The meeting deteriorated from there. Several residents tried to ask questions, but Kimberly kept shutting them down. Finally, she adjourned the meeting abruptly, and the board members huddled in a corner, shooting occasional glances in my direction. That went well, I muttered to Richard as we left. Actually, it did. We put them on notice in front of witnesses. They'll be more careful now. I wasn't so sure. Over the next week, I received 3 more certified letters from the HOA. The first demanded I allow construction to resume. The second informed me I was being fined $100 per day for noncompliance with community improvement initiatives. The third threatened to place a lien on my property if the fines weren't paid within 30 days. Richard filed responses to all 3, firmly rejecting each claim and reiterating that the HOA had no legal basis for any of their demands. He also filed a formal complaint with the county planning office, questioning how the construction permits had been approved without proper easement documentation. That inquiry apparently rattled some cages, because 2 weeks after the initial confrontation, I received a surprise visit from the county planning inspector. His name was Tom Bradley, and he looked tired. Mr. Quinn? Tom Bradley, County Planning Office. I need to inspect the area where construction was started. Sure, come around back. I led him to where the construction crew had begun excavating. They had removed vegetation and dug up about 40 feet of land before I'd stopped them. Tom took photos, measured distances, and checked his tablet several times. So here's the situation, he said finally. The HOA submitted permit applications showing an easement corridor along this route. But when I went to verify against the county property records, there's no easement registered for this parcel. That's what my lawyer found too. Tom nodded. Which means the permits were issued based on incorrect information. I'm going to have to revoke them pending proper documentation. The HOA needs to either produce a valid easement agreement or find a different route for their pathway. What about the damage they already did? That's between you and them. From a planning perspective, any restoration work won't require permits since it's just returning the land to its previous state. But if you're seeking damages or compensation, that's a civil matter. After Tom left, I walked around my property surveying the damage. Beyond the obvious excavation, they'd cut down 2 mature oak trees, destroyed about 60 feet of natural vegetation that provided privacy between my lot and the neighboring properties, and torn up an irrigation line I'd installed last spring. The more I looked, the angrier I got. That evening, I called Richard again. I want to send them a bill for restoration, damages, everything. That's your right. Let's document everything first. I'll send someone out to assess the damage and provide cost estimates. Then we'll send a formal demand letter. The assessment took 3 days. Richard hired an environmental consultant, a landscaping contractor, and a property damage appraiser. Their findings were detailed and expensive. The 2 oak trees they'd cut down were estimated at 40 years old and would cost $12,000 to replace with comparable mature trees. The destroyed vegetation required another $8,000 to restore. The irrigation system damage was $3,000. Then there were costs for soil remediation, grading restoration, and professional replanting to match the previous landscape. The total came to $37,000. Richard added legal fees and administrative costs, bringing the final number to $40,000 even. We sent the demand letter on a Friday afternoon via certified mail and email. The response came Monday morning, and it was exactly what I expected. Kimberly called me directly, which violated Richard's instruction that all communication go through him, but I answered anyway. $40,000? She practically shrieked. Are you insane? That's the cost to restore my property to its previous condition, which is what you're legally required to do since you damaged it without permission. We're not paying you $40,000 for some trees and bushes. Then I'll see you in court. Actually, my lawyer will see you in court. Don't call me again, Kimberly. I hung up and immediately called Richard to tell him about the conversation. He just laughed. Let her be angry. Anger makes people sloppy. We've got documentation, we've got the law on our side, and they've got nothing but entitlement and fake easement maps. But Kimberly wasn't done. That afternoon, I received a knock on my door from an Asheville Police Department officer. My stomach dropped, wondering what she'd accused me of now. Mr. Quinn? Officer Martinez, I need to ask you a few questions about a harassment complaint. Harassment? Against who? Ms. Kimberly Patterson filed a complaint stating you've been threatening her and other HOA board members. I sighed. Officer, that's completely false. The HOA has been trying to build on my property without permission. When I stopped them, the board president has been harassing me with fines and threats. My lawyer has documentation of everything. Officer Martinez looked skeptical, but took notes. Do you have copies of any communication between you and Ms. Patterson? Everything. Letters, emails, certified mail receipts, plus my lawyer has been handling most of it. Hold on. I grabbed my laptop and showed Officer Martinez the entire paper trail. The bogus fines, the threatening letters, the fake easement map, everything. His expression changed as he reviewed the documents. Sir, this looks like a civil property dispute, not a criminal harassment case. I'm going to note that in my report. If Ms. Patterson has issues with you, she should address them through the appropriate legal channels, not by filing false police reports. Thank you, officer. After he left, I called Richard for what felt like the 100th time that month. She filed a police report claiming I'm harassing her. Of course she did. That's defamation. Add it to the list of claims. Gregory, I think it's time we stop playing defense and go on offense. Let me file a lawsuit. Civil trespass, property damage, harassment, defamation, and abuse of process for the fake fines and police report. We'll also seek an injunction preventing them from any further action regarding your property. Do it. Richard filed the lawsuit 3 days later. I sued the HOA organization for $200,000 in damages, plus the $40,000 in restoration costs, plus attorney fees. I also named Kimberly personally for defamation and harassment. The other board members weren't individually named, but they were served as representatives of the HOA. The legal process moved slowly at first. We had a preliminary hearing where the judge reviewed the basic facts and issued a temporary restraining order preventing the HOA from taking any action regarding my property pending resolution of the case. That was a relief at least, but Kimberly and the HOA board didn't back down. They hired their own lawyer, an aggressive litigation firm out of Charlotte named Morrison & Associates. Their strategy became clear quickly. Bury us in paperwork and discovery requests, trying to run up our costs until I gave up. Richard had warned me this might happen. HOA litigation can get expensive. They're betting you can't afford to keep fighting. They're betting wrong. My grandfather left me more than just this property. I can afford to see this through. And I could, but it was still frustrating. For the next 6 months, my life revolved around depositions, document requests, and legal strategy sessions. The HOA's lawyers tried every angle to claim they had the right to build on my property. They argued community benefit, greater good, implied easements, prescriptive rights, and about a dozen other legal theories that Richard systematically demolished. The breakthrough came when Richard subpoenaed the original Mountain View Estates development plans from 1987 when the subdivision was first created. The plans clearly showed that my grandfather's property was not included in the HOA jurisdiction at all. He'd owned the land before the subdivision was built, and when the developers approached him about including it, he'd refused. The development had been built around his property, not including it. "This is huge," Richard explained during one of our meetings. "Your property was never part of the HOA to begin with. You shouldn't be getting any notices, fines, or communications from them at all. They have zero authority over you." Wait, so all those violation notices over the past 2 years? Completely invalid. You never should have been paying HOA fees either. Did they ever make you pay? No, that was one fight I actually won. They kept sending bills, but I never paid them because I couldn't find anything in my deed requiring it. Good instinct. We're adding that to the lawsuit. They've been harassing you and claiming authority they never had. This revelation changed everything. Richard filed an amended complaint and added claims for fraudulent misrepresentation and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The HOA's lawyers scrambled to respond, but the original development documents didn't lie. We finally got our trial date in November, almost 8 months after the initial incident. Richard had prepared exhaustively, and we had a strong case. The morning of the trial, I put on my best suit and met Richard at the courthouse in downtown Asheville. "Remember," he said as we walked in, "stay calm, answer questions directly, and don't let them provoke you. We've got this." The trial took 3 days. Richard presented our evidence methodically. The property deed showing no easement, the original development plans proving my property was never part of the HOA, the photographs of the damage, the expert assessments of restoration costs, the harassment timeline including the false police report, and everything else we'd compiled. The HOA's lawyers tried to argue community benefit and claimed that my grandfather had given verbal permission for future development, which was absurd and impossible to prove. They also tried to paint me as an unreasonable obstructionist who was preventing necessary community improvements, but their case fell apart during cross-examination of Kimberly. Richard was ruthless. "Ms. Patterson, when did you first verify that Mr. Quinn's property included an easement for the walking path?" The easement was shown on our community planning documents. "But did you verify it against the county property records?" Kimberly hesitated. "I relied on the documents we had." "So you didn't verify it?" "I trusted our records." "Ms. Patterson, you authorized construction on someone's private property without verifying you had the legal right to do so, correct?" "I believed we had the right." "Belief isn't a legal basis for property rights, is it?" "I'm not a lawyer." "No, but you are the president of an organization that claims to enforce property rules. Did you consult a lawyer before starting construction?" Another hesitation. "We have a legal consultant. Did you consult them about this specific project and whether you had the right to build on Mr. Quinn's land?" "We discussed the project generally." Richard pulled out a document. "This is a communication from your legal consultant dated 2 weeks before construction began, warning the board that the easement documentation for Mr. Quinn's property was unclear and recommending further verification before proceeding. Did you receive this communication?" Kimberly's face went pale. "I may have. It was sent to your email address and you replied acknowledging receipt. You proceeded with construction anyway, didn't you? We believed the benefits to the community justified moving forward. Even though you were warned the easement was questionable, I thought the lawyer was being overly cautious." That exchange basically ended the HOA's case. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning a verdict in my favor on all counts. They awarded me the full $40,000 in restoration costs, another $75,000 in damages for harassment and emotional distress, and $50,000 in punitive damages against Kimberly personally for the defamation and false police report, plus attorney fees, which added another $40,000. The total judgment was over $200,000. I saw Kimberly's face when the verdict was read, and I almost felt bad for her. Almost. Then I remembered watching that excavator tear up my grandfather's land, and the feeling passed. Outside the courthouse, Richard shook my hand. "Congratulations. That's one of the most complete victories I've seen in HOA litigation. Thanks for everything, Richard. What happens now? They have to pay the judgment. If they don't pay voluntarily, we can place liens on the HOA's accounts and assets. The punitive damages against Kimberly personally mean she may have to pay out of pocket unless her homeowner's insurance covers it, which I doubt given it was intentional conduct. Over the next few weeks, the fallout continued. The HOA initially tried to appeal the verdict, but their lawyers advised them the appeal had no merit and would just cost more money. They ended up paying the full judgment, which required a special assessment on all the actual HOA members to cover the costs. This did not make Kimberly popular. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that an emergency election was called and she was removed as board president. Several other board members resigned. The whole organization essentially collapsed and had to be restructured. But the story wasn't quite over. About a month after the judgment was paid, I got a call from Detective Sarah Reeves with the Asheville Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit. "Mr. Quinn, I'm investigating possible financial irregularities with the Mountain View Estates HOA. I understand you recently had a legal judgment against them." "That's right. During our investigation, we've discovered that the HOA's bank accounts don't match their reported expenses. Significant funds appear to be missing. I'm looking at the timeline, and it seems the discrepancies started around the time the board approved the walking path project. Did you ever see budget documents for that construction?" "No, they never shared financial details with me." "Can you tell me who was primarily handling the project on the HOA side?" "Kimberly Patterson, the board president, and Daniel Chen was the treasurer." "Thank you. We may need to talk with you again as the investigation continues." I called Richard immediately after hanging up. The police are investigating the HOA for financial crimes, missing funds related to the walking path project. Richard was quiet for a moment. That would explain a lot, actually. If someone was embezzling from the HOA accounts, building that pathway would be a good cover for moving money around. Construction projects have lots of expenses and the budget numbers can be fuzzy. "You think Kimberly was stealing?" "Could be her. Could be the treasurer, could be both. Either way, that's not our problem anymore. Let the police handle it." But I couldn't help following the case through the local news. The investigation took several months, but eventually, criminal charges were filed against both Kimberly Patterson and Daniel Chen. According to the indictment, they'd created fake invoices from the construction company and pocketed over $60,000 in HOA funds. The walking path project was legitimate, but they'd inflated the costs and stolen the difference. The irony wasn't lost on me. They'd been so aggressive about building on my property partly because they needed the project to continue their embezzlement scheme. If I'd just rolled over and let them build, they might have gotten away with it. Both Kimberly and Daniel eventually pleaded guilty to fraud and embezzlement charges. Kimberly got 18 months in prison and 5 years probation. Daniel got 12 months and probation. They also had to pay restitution to the HOA, though I doubted the homeowners would ever recover all the stolen money. Meanwhile, life gradually returned to normal for me. I used the judgment money to fully restore my property, and honestly, it looked better than before. The landscaping company did beautiful work, and the new irrigation system was way more efficient than what I'd had. I also installed a fence along the back property line, just to make absolutely clear where my land ended. The Mountain View Estates HOA eventually reformed under new leadership, people who actually understood property law and fiduciary responsibility. They sent me a formal apology letter, which I appreciated, and confirmed in writing that my property was not subject to HOA jurisdiction. I kept that letter in a safe deposit box just in case. I also received several apologies from neighbors who'd believed Kimberly's version of events at that emergency meeting. Most people had no idea what was really going on, and once the truth came out, they felt bad about how I'd been treated. I didn't hold grudges. They'd been lied to by someone they trusted. One neighbor, an older gentleman named Harold, who lived 3 houses down, stopped by one afternoon with a 6-pack of local beer. "I wanted to apologize personally," he said. "I believed Kimberly when she said you were being unreasonable about the pathway. I should have gotten your side before judging." "Don't worry about it," I said, accepting the beer. "Want to come in?" We ended up talking for 2 hours, and Harold became a good friend. He told me stories about the neighborhood's history and my grandfather, who apparently had been known for standing up to various authorities when he thought they were wrong. "You're just like him," Harold said. "John would be proud of how you handled this." That meant more to me than the money from the judgment. The new HOA board reached out about 9 months after the whole mess concluded with an interesting proposal. They still wanted to create a walking path connecting the two parts of the neighborhood, but they'd found an alternative route using an actual utility easement that ran behind several properties on the other side of the subdivision. Would I be willing to meet with them to discuss it and confirm I had no objections? I agreed to the meeting, and it was night and day, different from the interactions with Kimberly. The new board president, a retired engineer named Marcus Thompson, brought proper survey maps, explained exactly what they wanted to do, and asked thoughtful questions about whether their planned route would affect anyone else the way Kimberly's plan had affected me. I just want to make sure we do this right," Marcus said. "The previous board's mistakes hurt a lot of people, including you. We're trying to rebuild trust." I appreciate that. For what it's worth, I think a walking path is a good idea. Hemlock Road really is dangerous for pedestrians. Just make sure you have all the legal documentation in order before you start construction. Already verified everything with the county and with a real estate attorney. We've learned our lesson. The new walking path was completed the following spring. It was well designed, properly lit, and by all accounts the neighbors loved it. Kids could walk to each other's houses safely. People could go for evening strolls without worrying about cars. And it did exactly what Kimberly had claimed the original route would do, but without destroying anyone's private property. Marcus invited me to the small ribbon-cutting ceremony they held, which I found amusing but attended anyway. Several neighbors thanked me for standing my ground, saying my lawsuit had exposed the corruption and financial mismanagement that never would have come to light otherwise. The HOA was now operating transparently with regular audits and proper oversight. As for Kimberly and Daniel, I honestly felt a bit sorry for them by the end. They'd let greed and entitlement drive them to commit crimes that destroyed their reputations and freedom. Kimberly lost her house during the legal proceedings, and her family reportedly moved out of state. Daniel's wife divorced him while he was in prison. Their lives were ruined over $60,000 in a power trip. One afternoon, about a year after everything concluded, I was sitting on my back porch, looking at the restored landscaping, when Richard called. "Gregory, I wanted to let you know that the Bar Association is using your case in their continuing legal education program as an example of HOA, overreach and property rights litigation." "Really?" "Really. It's become a pretty well-known case in property law circles. You stood up for your rights when a lot of people would have just given in, and you exposed significant corruption in the process. That matters." After we hung up, I thought about everything that had happened. Finding that construction crew on my property that March morning had been infuriating and stressful, and the following months of legal battles hadn't been fun. But I'd protected the land my grandfather left me, held people accountable for their actions, and maybe made things better for my neighbors in the long run. The 2 replacement oak trees were growing well. They were big when they were planted, but they still had decades of growth ahead of them. I liked thinking that maybe someday my own grandkids would climb them the way I'd climbed the originals. I also kept the $40,000 bill framed in my home office, not out of spite, but as a reminder. A reminder that property rights matter, that standing up to bullies is worth the cost, and that documentation and good legal counsel are invaluable. Harold joked that I should hang it in my living room as a conversation starter, but I preferred keeping it private. As the neighborhood settled into a peaceful rhythm, the HOA operated properly under its new leadership, focusing on actual community needs rather than power trips and personal enrichment. People maintained their properties, attended the occasional community event, and generally got along. It was what a homeowners association should be, existing to serve the community rather than control it. I never did end up joining any HOA committees or getting involved in the organization, even though Marcus asked a few times. I'd had enough of HOA politics to last a lifetime, but I did contribute to neighborhood events and helped out when people needed it, which seemed like a better way to be part of the community anyway. Sometimes on evening walks around my property, I'd look at the fence line and think about how different things could have been. If I'd been less informed about my rights, if I hadn't inherited enough money to afford a good lawyer, if I'd been intimidated by Kimberly's threats, they would have built that path right through my land, and the embezzlement would have continued, probably for years, with dozens of homeowners unknowingly funding someone's greed. One thing I learned through all of this was that HOAs operate in a weird legal gray area where they have significant power over people's homes and lives, but there's often limited oversight of how they use that power. The homeowners in Mountain View Estates had trusted their board to act responsibly, and that trust had been betrayed. It took an outside conflict, my lawsuit, to shine a light on what was really happening. I also learned that standing up for yourself makes some people angry, but earns respect from many more. After the trial, several neighbors told me they'd had their own issues with Kimberly and the previous board, but hadn't known how to fight back. Some had paid bogus fines just to avoid conflict. Others had been bullied into expensive property modifications based on rules that didn't actually exist. My case had given them a roadmap for pushing back. Richard told me he'd taken on 3 more HOA cases in the Asheville area since mine concluded, all referrals from people who'd heard about my situation. He was becoming something of a specialist in HOA litigation, which he found both profitable and satisfying. These organizations need to be held accountable, he said. Most operate fine, but the ones that go bad can make people's lives miserable. The criminal cases against Kimberly and Daniel wound their way through the system. I had to testify at Daniel's trial about the timeline of events in the construction project, but my involvement was minimal. The prosecution's case was built mainly on bank records, fraudulent invoices, and testimony from the actual construction company, which had no idea their name was being used to justify fake expenses. The construction company owner, a straightforward guy named Mike Hernandez, was actually pretty angry about the whole situation. "They make me look like I was involved," he told me after one court session. "My company's reputation took a hit because people thought we were part of the scam. We just did the work we were hired for and charged our normal rates. Did you ever actually work on the walking path project?" "We started it, yeah. The day you shut us down. We billed them for exactly 3 hours of excavator time and the disposal fees for the trees we removed. That's it. But according to the fake invoices they created, we supposedly charged them $35,000 for that project. It's insane." That conversation made me even more glad I'd fought back. The corruption had spread beyond just stealing from the HOA members. It had involved fraud against local businesses and abuse of the legal system. Kimberly and Daniel hadn't just been bad HOA board members, they'd been actual criminals. The judge in Daniel's case seemed to share that view. During sentencing, she gave a speech about the violation of trust involved when people in positions of community leadership abuse their authority for personal gain. "Homeowners associations exist to serve their communities," she said. "When board members treat them as personal piggy banks, it undermines the entire concept of community self-governance." Daniel's wife was in the courtroom that day, crying quietly while her soon-to-be ex-husband was sentenced. I felt bad for her. She had had no involvement in the fraud and was now dealing with the fallout of someone else's terrible decisions. Their kids were teenagers, and I couldn't imagine how hard this must be for them. But sympathy didn't change the facts. Daniel and Kimberly had made their choices, and choices have consequences. Back at home, life moved on. I started dating someone I'd met at a local bookstore, a teacher named Andrea, who thought the whole HOA saga was hilarious and kept calling me a property rights warrior. We'd go for walks around the neighborhood, including on the new pathway, and she'd joke about whether I was going to inspect it for code violations. "I'm retired from HOA battles," I'd tell her. "Someone else can be the neighborhood watchdog now." "Good. Because I was worried you'd turn into one of those people who goes to every board meeting with a clipboard and complaints." "Never. I just wanted to be left alone on my own property. That's all I ever wanted." And that was true. I hadn't set out to become some kind of HOA accountability crusader or test case in property law. I just wanted to drink my coffee in peace without watching strangers tear up my grandfather's land. Everything else had followed from that simple desire to protect what was mine. The restoration work on my property was completed by late summer, and it looked fantastic. The landscaping company had done an incredible job matching the native vegetation and creating a natural look that blended seamlessly with the surrounding forest. The new oak trees were thriving, their leaves turning brilliant colors in the fall. The irrigation system kept everything healthy and green. I sometimes wondered what my grandfather would have thought about the whole situation. Based on what Harold and other neighbors told me, he probably would have handled it similarly. John Quinn had been known for standing his ground when he knew he was right. He'd fought the original developers when they wanted to include his property in the HOA, and he'd won that battle 30 years before I won mine. "Your grandfather was stubborn as hell," Harold told me one evening over beers. "But he was stubborn about the right things. He knew what mattered, and he didn't back down. The developers offered him good money to sell them a chunk of his land for development, and he turned them down flat. Said his land wasn't for sale at any price." I never knew that. Oh yeah, they weren't happy about it either. Meant their subdivision had to be configured around his property, which complicated the planning. But John didn't care. It was his land, and that was that. Hearing those stories made me feel connected to my grandfather in a way I hadn't before. I'd inherited more than just property from him. I'd inherited his values in his spine. That felt like a better legacy than any amount of money. The holidays came and went. Andrea and I hosted Thanksgiving, inviting Harold and a few other neighbors who'd become friends. We carefully avoided talking about HOA drama, instead focusing on food, football, and the fact that Andrea's attempt at homemade cranberry sauce had gone hilariously wrong. "It's supposed to be sauce, not rubber," she laughed, trying to cut it with a knife. "I followed the recipe. Maybe we should stick with the canned stuff next year," I suggested diplomatically. "Oh, we're definitely doing that." It was nice having these normal moments after a year of legal battles and stress. This was what life was supposed to be about: good people, good food, and laughter. Not fighting with power-hungry HOA presidents over property rights. In December, I received a final piece of closure. The HOA's insurance company sent me a check for additional damages they'd determined they were liable for. Something about my property values being temporarily affected by the controversy. It was only $5,000, but combined with everything else, it meant I'd actually profited from standing up for myself. I used that money to install solar panels on my roof, which reduced my electric bills to almost nothing. Practical and environmentally friendly, which seemed like a fitting way to use unexpected money that came from defeating an unnecessarily adversarial HOA. Richard called in January to tell me that my case had been cited in a court decision in Tennessee involving similar HOA overreach. "You're officially legal precedent now," he said with obvious pride. "Is that good?" "It's very good. It means other people in situations like yours can point to your case and say, 'Look, this court already decided HOAs can't do this.' It strengthens property rights protections across the board. I found that satisfying in a way I hadn't expected. My grandfather's land hadn't just been protected. The battle to protect it was now helping other people protect their property too. That felt meaningful. As winter turned to spring, I spent more time working on my property. I cleared some trails through the wooded areas, built a small deck overlooking the creek that ran through the back corner, and generally enjoyed having the space to myself. Andrea came over most weekends, and we'd hike the trails or just sit on the deck reading. "This place really is special," she said one afternoon. "I get why you fought so hard for it." "It's not just the place," I said. "It's the principle. If I'd let them walk all over me, they would have kept doing it, to me and to everyone else." "Well, I'm glad you stood up to them, even if your stubbornness is sometimes annoying." "Hey," she laughed. "I'm kidding, mostly." By the second anniversary of that March morning when I'd found the construction crew on my property, life had fully returned to normal. Better than normal, actually. I had a wonderful relationship with Andrea, genuine friendships with several neighbors, a beautiful property that I'd successfully defended, and the satisfaction of knowing I'd done the right thing even when it was difficult and expensive. The legal bills had been significant, but the judgment had covered them, and then some. More importantly, I'd learned a lot about property law, my own capabilities, and what matters in life. I'd also learned that good legal counsel is worth every penny, and that documentation is your best friend in any dispute. I framed some of the key documents from the case and hung them in my home office alongside the $40,000 bill. the restraining order preventing the HOA from touching my property, the jury verdict form, the judge's final order. They told a story of standing up for what was right and winning. Marcus, from the new HOA board, stopped by one day to ask if I'd be willing to speak at a community meeting about property rights and HOA best practices. I initially declined, but Andrea convinced me to do it. "You have knowledge that could help people," she said. "Share it." So I agreed, and ended up giving a 30-minute presentation on understanding your property rights, the importance of reviewing HOA documents carefully, and how to push back appropriately if an HOA oversteps its authority. The turnout was bigger than expected, with people from several nearby neighborhoods attending. During the Q&A session afterward, one woman raised her hand. "What if you can't afford a lawyer like you could? What if the HOA is bullying you, but you don't have the money to fight back?" It was a fair question. I'd been fortunate to inherit enough money to fund the legal battle. "Start with documentation," I said. "Keep records of everything. Write down what happens and when. Then look for legal aid organizations or lawyers who do free consultations. Sometimes just having a lawyer send one strong letter is enough to make an HOA back down. They usually don't want actual legal fights. They're counting on you being too intimidated or too poor to resist." Richard, who'd come to the presentation, added, "I've also started taking some HOA cases on contingency, meaning I only get paid if we win. If you've got a solid case, lawyers will be willing to work with you on payment arrangements." That seemed to help. Several people came up afterward to thank me and ask follow-up questions. A few shared their own HOA horror stories, most of which were minor compared to mine, but still frustrating for the people dealing with them. One elderly man told me his HOA had fined him for painting his shutters the wrong color, even though he'd used the approved color from their list. "They're just on a power trip," he said. "I'm tempted to just pay the fine and forget about it." "Don't," I told him. "If they approved the color and you used it, they can't fine you. That's capricious enforcement. Push back. Make them explain in writing why they're fining you when you followed their rules." He nodded thoughtfully. "I might do that. Your story gave me courage." Driving home that night, I reflected on how strange life could be. 2 years ago, I'd been a quiet guy who just wanted to be left alone on his inherited property. Now I was apparently some kind of local expert on HOA disputes and property rights. It wasn't a role I'd sought out, but maybe it was one I was meant for. Andrea reached over and squeezed my hand. "You did good tonight. A lot of people needed to hear that they don't have to just accept whatever their HOA tells them. I just told them what I learned the hard way. That's the best kind of teaching." The following months were peaceful. The HOA continued operating responsibly under Marcus's leadership. My property remained beautiful and undisturbed. Andrea and I talked about moving in together, maybe building a small guest house on my land where she could have her own space for working on lesson plans and I could keep my office. "Just make sure we get all the proper permits," she joked. "I don't want the HOA coming after us. We're not in the HOA, remember? That was the whole point." "Right. Still, let's do everything by the book. I've had enough excitement from your property disputes." "That makes 2 of us." I heard through Harold that Kimberly had been released from prison after serving 13 months of her 18-month sentence, getting time off for good behavior. She'd moved somewhere in Florida to live with relatives, trying to start over somewhere no one knew her story. I hoped she'd learned from her mistakes and could build a better life, though I suspected she'd always be bitter about how things had turned out. Daniel was still in prison, but would be released soon. His wife had fully divorced him and moved with their kids to another state. His life was essentially destroyed, all because he'd thought he could skim some money from the HOA accounts without getting caught. The whole situation was a good reminder that ethical shortcuts rarely end well. If Kimberly and Daniel had just done their jobs honestly, they'd still be respected members of the community living their normal lives. Instead, they'd thrown everything away for relatively small amounts of money and the thrill of getting away with something. Meanwhile, I was living my best life on the property I'd successfully defended. The trees were growing, the gardens were flourishing, and every morning I could sit on my porch with my coffee, knowing that nobody was going to come tear up my land without permission. That March morning 2 years ago had been shocking and infuriating, but looking back now, I was almost grateful for it. The experience had taught me things about myself and about standing up for what's right. It had connected me with good people like Richard and Andrea and Harold. It had given me a story that was helping others protect their own properties and rights. And most importantly, it had protected my grandfather's legacy. The land he'd loved and defended and left to me remained intact and beautiful, just as he'd intended. That felt like honoring his memory in the best possible way. As spring turned to summer, Andrea and I started planning the guest house. We hired an architect who drew up beautiful plans for a small but efficient structure that would blend into the property's natural setting. We submitted all the proper permit applications to the county, got everything approved, and broke ground in June. The construction crew we hired was professional and careful, staying exactly within the property lines and taking care not to damage any of the surrounding vegetation. It was everything the HOA's crew hadn't been, and I appreciated their professionalism. Marcus actually stopped by while construction was happening, just to say hello and see what we were building. "Guest house looks great," he said. "Glad to see someone doing construction the right way around here." "Yeah, well, I learned my lesson about the importance of proper permits and boundaries," he laughed. "I bet you did. Hey, I wanted to let you know, the board is having an anniversary celebration for the walking path next month. 1 year since it opened. You're welcome to come if you want." "I might actually do that," I said, surprising myself. "The path turned out great, and you guys handled the whole thing properly. We tried to learn from past mistakes. Your lawsuit was an expensive lesson, but a necessary one." The guest house was completed by late summer. Andrea moved in her things, and we settled into a comfortable routine of living together but having our own spaces when we needed them. It was the perfect arrangement, and having gone through the whole permitting process properly meant I never had to worry about legal issues. One evening in September, almost exactly 18 months after the trial concluded, I got an unexpected call from Kimberly. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the better of me. "Gregory, it's Kimberly Patterson. I know I'm probably the last person you want to hear from." "That's accurate. What do you want?" I wanted to apologize, really apologize, not the half-hearted sorry my lawyers made me give during the trial. What I did was wrong. Not just the embezzlement, but trying to build on your property without checking if we had the right, then doubling down when you pushed back instead of admitting the mistake. I was on a power trip, and I hurt a lot of people. I was quiet for a moment, not sure how to respond. "Okay, I accept your apology. I also wanted you to know that I'm paying back the restitution. It'll take years, but I'm working 2 jobs and sending money every month. I want to make things right, even though I know I can never fully fix what I broke." "That's good, Kimberly. I hope you can rebuild your life." "Thank you, and I'm sorry for everything." After she hung up, I sat there thinking about the call. Part of me was skeptical about whether she was genuinely sorry or just wanted absolution. But another part of me wanted to believe people could learn and change. Maybe prison had given her perspective. Maybe losing everything had taught her what actually mattered in life. I told Andrea about the call later. "Do you think she really means it?" she asked. "I don't know. Maybe. Does it matter?" "I guess not. You won, she lost, and justice was served. Whether she's actually sorry doesn't change any of that." "True, but I'd still like to think people can change." "You're too nice sometimes. Someone has to balance out your cynicism." She threw a pillow at me, and we both laughed. As fall arrived and the leaves started turning colors again, I found myself reflecting on how much had changed in 2.5 years. I'd gone from a quiet guy who'd inherited his grandfather's property to someone who'd fought a major legal battle, exposed criminal corruption, became legal precedent, and built a life with someone I loved on land I'd successfully defended. The property looked spectacular in autumn. The oak trees I'd fought so hard to protect blazed with orange and gold. The new trees were thriving, their leaves joining in the seasonal display. The gardens Andrea and I had planted together added splashes of color around both houses. "This is exactly what life should be," Andrea said one evening as we sat on the deck watching the sunset. "Beautiful, peaceful, and fought for." Fought for. Things worth having are worth fighting for. You fought for this land, and now we get to enjoy it. That makes it even more special. She was right. The easy path would have been to let the HOA do whatever they wanted, avoid the conflict, and just accept the loss of part of my property. But that would have felt wrong every single day. Every time I looked at that walking path cutting through my land, I would have felt the sting of letting someone walk all over me. Instead, I'd stood my ground. I'd spent money and time and energy fighting for what was right. And now I got to enjoy the victory every single day, knowing that this land was truly mine, protected and preserved exactly as my grandfather had intended. That was worth every penny, every hour in legal meetings, every stressful moment of the trial. It was worth the anger and frustration and uncertainty, because in the end, I'd won. Not just the case, but something more important, my self-respect and the knowledge that I could stand up for myself when it really mattered. As the evening darkened and stars appeared overhead, I thought about that March morning that had started everything. The shock of seeing the construction crew, the anger at the violation of my property, the determination to fight back. That morning had changed my life in ways I never could have anticipated. It had led to legal battles and criminal investigations, to new friendships and a relationship with Andrea, to becoming legal precedent and helping others protect their own rights. It had connected me to my grandfather's legacy in a deeper way and taught me things about myself I hadn't known. And now, sitting here on my protected property with the woman I loved, surrounded by trees and gardens and natural beauty, I could honestly say I was grateful for all of it, even the difficult parts, maybe especially the difficult parts, because those were what made the victory meaningful. The HOA had paved a walking path straight across my property without permission. I'd sent them a removal bill for $40,000. They'd refused to pay, so I'd taken them to court and won everything. The board president had gone to prison for embezzlement. The organization had been reformed. Justice had been served. But more than that, I'd learned that standing up for yourself matters, that knowing your rights and defending them is worth the cost, that good people will support you when you're fighting for something right, and that land protected is land truly owned in the deepest sense of the word. As Andrea leaned against my shoulder and the last light faded from the sky, I felt completely at peace. This was my land, my home, my life. I'd fought for it and won, and now I got to enjoy the rewards of that fight every single day. That March morning had been an ending and a beginning. The end of quietly accepting whatever the HOA decided, and the beginning of standing up for my rights and my property. The end of being an isolated neighbor, and the beginning of real community connections. The end of one chapter, and the beginning of another. And this new chapter, hard-won and deeply satisfying, was better than anything I could have imagined back then. That made every moment of the fight worthwhile. The stars grew brighter overhead, and I smiled. Life was good. Justice had prevailed, and my grandfather's land remained exactly as it should be, protected, beautiful, and home.